What if the very pain that tried to silence you became the voice that inspired the world? We've all faced struggles that made us feel powerless. But some people find a way to rise above, turning their scars into strength. Maya Angelou did exactly that, and her journey proves that no pain is wasted when courage speaks. As a child, Maya Angelou faced unthinkable trauma. For years, she stopped speaking, believing her words carried no power. Yet in silence, she discovered something greater, an inner world of rhythm, poetry, and resilience. When she finally found her voice again, it was unstoppable. That voice carried her from hardship to history, from pain to poetry, from silence to songs of freedom. And through her words, millions found hope. The sound of a child's laughter is supposed to fill a house with light. But on that morning in rural Arkansas, the sound faded into shadows. A young Maya, barely 7 years old, stood in a dimly lit room, her small hands trembling against the fabric of her dress. The world around her felt too large, too cruel, and suddenly unsafe. Something unspeakable had been done to her, something that stole more than her innocence. It stole her voice. The air was heavy, thick with whispers that would never fully be spoken aloud. Outside, cicadas hummed against the humid southern air, their endless rhythm a cruel reminder that life moved on, even when a child's heart had stopped beating in trust. Maya's eyes, wide with fear, darted to the corners of the room as if the walls themselves had betrayed her. She wanted to scream. She wanted to tell someone. But when she finally did, when her fragile truth spilled out, something darker followed. Not long after she spoke, the man who had hurt her was taken away. And then, suddenly, he was gone forever dead. The adults whispered words Maya didn't fully understand. He was found. He didn't make it. God's judgment. To a child's heart, it meant only one thing. Her voice had killed him. From that moment, Maya chose silence. She sealed her words deep inside, believing her voice carried a curse too dangerous to release. Day after day, she stopped speaking. Weeks turned into months, and months stretched into years. Her family tried to coax words from her lips, but she shook her head, keeping her world locked away. A little girl who once sang songs on the porch now sat with her lips pressed tight, her eyes speaking louder than her mouth ever could. Imagine it. A child trapped in silence, carrying the weight of guilt that wasn't hers to bear. Each day at her grandmother's house in Stamps, Arkansas, she moved quietly through the world, folding laundry, carrying water, reading scriptures, without uttering a sound. Her grandmother, a deeply religious woman, prayed over her, hoping the silence would lift like morning fog. But Maya's vow was stronger than prayer, stronger than fear. She believed she had to protect others from her voice. And yet, in that silence, something remarkable began to grow. The absence of speech sharpened her other senses. The rustle of wind through pine trees became music. The shuffle of shoes on a wooden floor turned into rhythm. She noticed the pauses in people's voices, the tremble of sorrow in her grandmother's hymns, the pride in the preacher's booming Sunday sermons. Words were still alive for her, not spoken, but absorbed, studied, memorized. Books became her refuge. Stacks of poetry, black folklore, Shakespeare, and the voices of great writers filled the quiet spaces where her own voice used to live. She would sit for hours, her eyes moving hungrily across the pages, tasting every word as if it were food for her starving soul. Silence, once a prison, slowly became a doorway to imagination. But still, she did not speak. Neighbors began to call her the mute child. Children teased her. Adults whispered, "She won't ever talk again." And Maya, she carried on with dignity, her silence both shield and burden. Little did the world know, that very silence was forging something unbreakable. The voice she had hidden away would one day come back, not as a whisper, but as thunder, not as weakness, but as power. This was not just the story of a girl who stopped speaking. This was the beginning of a legend, the painful silence that would one day echo into poetry, music, and freedom songs heard across the globe. Because sometimes, the greatest voices are born in the quietest prisons. The small town of Stamps, Arkansas, breathed in whispers. Dust floated across unpaved streets. carried by the southern wind that smelled of pine and earth. Neighbors lingered on porches, rocking chairs creaking as gossip filled the spaces where silence lived. And at the center of those whispers was the little girl who refused to speak. Maya. Children pointed at her during school, their voices cruel in the careless way only children can be. "Why don't you talk?" they would sneer. "Cat got your tongue." But Maya would not answer. She kept her eyes down, her hands folded, her lips sealed. To the outside world, she was strange, broken, maybe even cursed. To Maya, she was protecting the world from her own dangerous voice. In classrooms, teachers grew frustrated. "Child, you must read aloud," they insisted, pushing books into her hands. Maya would open them, eyes tracing the words, but her mouth stayed closed. Some teachers gave up, shaking their heads in defeat. Others scolded her, telling her she'd never amount to anything if she refused to speak. Each comment carved deeper into her young heart, confirming the lie she carried, that she was nothing, that she had destroyed with her voice. Yet, while the world dismissed her silence, something sacred was happening inside. Her mind became a vast recording studio, capturing every tone, every rhythm, every cadence of voices around her. She learned the language of human emotion, the sigh after a long day, the tremor of anger hiding in politeness, the laughter that cracked like glass when forced. Silence had trained her to hear what most people ignored. At home, her grandmother, stern, strong, rooted in faith, watched her carefully. "Sister, the Lord gave you a mouth for a reason," she would mutter, hoping Maya might one day let sound escape. But Maya just nodded softly, her voice still locked away. She wanted to explain, to tell her grandmother that her words killed a man, that speaking could destroy lives. But how could a child carry that story, let alone share it? Silence felt safer. The black church and stamps became another stage where Maya's silence stood out. On Sunday mornings, the congregation swayed and clapped, the preacher's booming voice filling the room like thunder. Testimonies were spoken, prayers shouted, songs lifted high. And there was Maya, small, still, almost invisible. She listened with hungry ears, memorizing scripture, poetry, and the hypnotic rhythm of sermons. She never joined in, but every word etched itself deep into her memory. One day, her grandmother's friend, Mrs. Bertha Flowers, a dignified woman with grace and wisdom, decided the silence could not win. She invited Maya to her home. The parlor smelled of vanilla and warm biscuits, and shelves of books lined the walls like guardians of truth. Mrs. Flowers spoke gently, with kindness, as if her words were pearls meant for Maya alone. "My dear," she said, "words are more than sounds. They are things. They matter. They live." Maya sat quietly, her wide eyes fixed on the woman's face. Mrs. Flowers picked up a book of poetry and began to read aloud. Her voice carried music, strength, and beauty. Each line floated like a song, wrapping itself around Maya's silence. When she finished, she placed the book in Maya's hands. "You don't have to speak to me," she said softly. "But read, my dear. Read aloud when you're alone. Words are meant to be given life." Maya nodded, clutching the book as though it were sacred. That night, in the safety of her room, she opened the book and whispered the first lines. Her voice cracked, shaky, almost foreign after so long. She stopped, heart pounding. But then she tried again. Softly, cautiously. The silence had cracked, just a little. In the days that followed, she practiced alone, her whispers carrying poetry into the air. She read Shakespeare, black poets, Dickens, giving voice to words too beautiful to remain trapped on paper. Still, she did not speak to others, not yet. But within her silence, the seed had been planted. The whispers in the town continued. That mute child. That broken girl. But Maya knew something they didn't. Inside her, words were growing, rehearsing, waiting for the day they would return. And when they did, they would not return timidly. They would come back with the force of survival, the strength of resilience, and the fire of truth. For now, the world saw only silence. But silence was molding her. And silence, though heavy, would one day become the birthplace of her power. The small library in Stamps was hardly more than a dusty room with creaking shelves, but to Maya it felt like a cathedral. While other children ran through fields chasing games, she sat in corners, surrounded by words. She couldn't speak them aloud to people, but she devoured them in silence, letting them echo in her mind like music only she could hear. The first time she discovered Shakespeare, it was as if the poet had reached through time and spoken directly into her heart. "I know why the caged bird sings," she thought, long before those words became her own. She recognized herself in every metaphor, every hidden cry between the lines. She was caged too, trapped by silence, misunderstood by her world, but filled with a song no one else could hear. She read Paul Laurence Dunbar, whose poetry carried the rhythm of black struggle and pride. She studied Dickens and memorized entire passages, not to recite them in public, but to keep them alive inside her. The words became her secret language, her private rebellion against the idea that she was broken. Every page she turned was a brick in the foundation of the woman she would become. At night, when the town went quiet and the cicadas hummed outside her window, Maya whispered the words under her breath. The sentences trembled from her lips, sometimes stuttering, sometimes rushing like water finally escaping a dam. No one else heard them, but she did, and each night, the sound of her own voice in the darkness stitched her closer to healing. Her grandmother noticed a change. Though Maya remained mute in public, her eyes sparkled differently when she read. She carried herself with a dignity far beyond her years, as if she had discovered a secret treasure the world could never take from her. People whispered, "That child is strange," but her grandmother smiled knowingly. She believed God was working in Maya's silence, shaping her spirit for something greater. And then there was Mrs. Flowers, who continued to guide her gently. Whenever Maya visited, Mrs. Flowers read aloud with a richness that turned words into life itself. She didn't just want Maya to listen. She wanted her to feel the power of language. "Poetry is not just to be read," she told her. "It is to be spoken, to be lived." Maya listened, every syllable embedding itself in her soul. And when she returned home, she practiced. She stood in front of the mirror, lips moving, her voice trembling as she gave life to the poems she had memorized. At first, the sound frightened her, small, broken, like a bird learning to sing again after years of silence. But with each night, her voice grew steadier, clearer, more confident. Still, she would not speak to people. Not yet. The fear was too heavy, the guilt too sharp. She carried the secret lie that her words could kill, and that lie chained her tongue. But in the quiet of her room, she was no longer a mute child. She was a storyteller, a poet, a singer of truth. Books gave her a voice the world couldn't silence. And even though she spoke only to herself, she was rehearsing for the day her words would rise beyond whispers. Because when a child learns to hold entire worlds within her silence, what happens when she finally decides to speak? She doesn't just talk. She transforms. She doesn't just recite. She awakens. And Maya Angelou, though she didn't know it yet, was awakening. Slowly, quietly, powerfully. The children of Stamps didn't understand her. They saw only a girl who wouldn't speak, a shadow who carried her silence like a shield. In the schoolyard, voices rang out, teasing, mocking, cutting. "Why don't you talk, Maya?" One boy jeered, circling her like a predator sensing weakness. "She's dumb." Another laughed, throwing a pebble at her feet. "Bet she ain't even got a tongue." The word stung, but Maya's face stayed still. Her silence became her armor. She didn't flinch, didn't cry, didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. But deep inside, the wounds carved themselves deeper. Each insult became a chain on her spirit, reminding her she was different, reminding her she was alone. And yet, in that loneliness, she discovered something extraordinary. While other children filled their days with chatter, Maya's silence sharpened her imagination. She watched people carefully, studying the tilt of their heads, the flicker in their eyes, the tremble in their hands. She could see truths that words often tried to hide. She could hear the pain tucked between laughter, the longing wrapped inside a sigh. It was as if silence had given her X-ray vision into the human soul. At night, she would retreat into her world of books. She devoured poetry, novels, scripture. her eyes racing across the pages like a starving traveler devouring a feast. Dunbar's poetry felt like a secret conversation between them. He wrote of cages and birds, of songs sung through pain. Maya felt seen in his words. She was the caged bird, wings clipped by silence, heart heavy with guilt. But she also carried a song deep inside her chest, waiting to break free. There were nights when she closed the book and pressed her hands against her throat, wondering if her voice still lived there. She would whisper softly, testing the sound. A line of Shakespeare, a verse of scripture, a scrap of song she remembered from before the silence. The words came out cracked, raw, but alive. Each time, she grew braver. Her grandmother noticed how she lingered over books, how her eyes glowed when she read in private. But to others, she still remained mute. Church members whispered prayers for her healing. Neighbors shook their heads and called her strange. Some said she'd never speak again. But silence, Maya knew, was not just emptiness. It was her sanctuary, her training ground. The words she swallowed built pressure inside her, like water dammed behind stone. And one day, she knew, they would rush forth with unstoppable force. Until then, she listened. She memorized. She stored stories in her heart. She carried poems like secret weapons, hidden but sharp. She lived in two worlds. The outer world that saw only a mute child, and the inner world where she was alive with words, rhythm, and song. And even in her silence, she began to sense it. The faint beating of wings inside her chest, the stirrings of a song too powerful to be contained forever. Because cages do not last forever, and silence, no matter how heavy, cannot hold a soul destined to sing. The summer sun in Stamps was relentless, pouring heat across the dirt roads and wooden porches, baking the little Arkansas town into a slow rhythm of sweat and patience. It was on one such day that Maya's grandmother called her over, a rare smile softening the stern lines of her face. "Marguerite," she said, using Maya's given name, "go on and take these groceries to Mrs. Flowers. And mind your manners. Mrs. Flowers is a lady of great refinement." Maya's heart leapt with both fear and curiosity. She had seen Mrs. Bertha Flowers before, a woman of grace who seemed to carry poetry in her very posture. Her dresses were always immaculate, her speech smooth and deliberate, as though she weighed each word before releasing it into the air. To Maya, Mrs. Flowers was more than a neighbor. She was a vision of what a black woman could be in a world that often tried to strip dignity away. Carrying the bag of flour and sugar, Maya walked slowly toward the Flowers' home. The house stood like a queen on its corner, shaded by magnolia trees. The moment Maya stepped inside, the scent of vanilla and old books wrapped around her like an embrace. She stood silently, eyes wide, as Mrs. Flowers greeted her with a warm smile. "Come in, child," she said, her voice like honey, smooth and rich. "Set the bag on the table." Maya obeyed, setting the groceries down. She avoided eye contact, her silence pressing against the room. Most adults would have scolded her by now, demanded a response, but Mrs. Flowers did not. She simply studied Maya with eyes that saw past the quiet. "You do not like to talk much, do you?" she asked gently. Maya lowered her head, saying nothing. Her silence answered for her. Mrs. Flowers nodded thoughtfully, as if she understood. Then she moved to a bookshelf and pulled down a slim, leather-bound volume. She opened it and began to read aloud. Her voice carried magic, each syllable pronounced with elegance, each line filled with life. Maya stood frozen, listening as if the words themselves were wings lifting her from the weight of silence. When Mrs. Flowers closed the book, she looked directly at Maya. "You see, my dear," she said softly, "words are not just ink on paper. They are meant to be spoken. They are alive. They live inside us until we give them breath." She handed the book to Maya. The child took it carefully, almost reverently. "Read these aloud when you are alone," Mrs. Flowers instructed. "Let your voice meet the words. You don't have to speak to anyone else, not until you're ready. But let the words live, child. Promise me." Maya nodded silently, clutching the book against her chest. She wanted to thank Mrs. Flowers, to let her know how much it meant, but the words caught in her throat. Still, Mrs. Flowers seemed to understand. She smiled, placing a gentle hand on Maya's shoulder. That night, Maya sat on her bed, the book open before her. The house was quiet, the only sound the chirping of crickets through the open window. Her hands trembled as she traced the lines on the page. She took a breath, and for the first time in years, she let the words slip past her lips. At first, they were barely a whisper, thin and shaky. But she tried again, and then again. Slowly, her voice began to form the rhythm of the poetry, each word carrying a piece of her soul. She stopped, startled by the sound of herself. Then she smiled faintly. It felt good. It felt alive. Night after night, she returned to the book, whispering lines until her voice grew steadier, fuller. She still did not speak to others, but in the sanctuary of her room, she was free. Free to let words exist again. Free to let her voice find its way back into the world. The townsfolk still called her mute. Teachers still shook their heads in frustration. Children still teased. But Maya knew something had shifted. A door had opened inside her. Mrs. Flowers had handed her more than a book. She had handed her a key. And though Maya still lived in silence, for the first time she began to believe that silence was not forever. Because in the hands of a child, one book, one voice, and one moment of kindness can become the spark that lights a lifetime. The house in Stamps was small, wooden, and filled with the scent of soap and pine oil from her grandmother's endless cleaning. During the day it rang with chores, the clatter of pots, the sound of water being carried in tin buckets, the hum of her grandmother's hymns. But at night, when the lamps were blown out and shadows stretched across the walls, it became Maya's private theater. She would wait until the town was hushed, until even her grandmother's snores settled into rhythm, and then she would open Mrs. Flower's book. The pages felt sacred, the black letters glowing like sparks in the dim light. She whispered the lines carefully, as though each one was a secret confession. Her voice was thin at first, like a bird learning to sing after being caged too long. Sometimes the words cracked. Sometimes her throat tightened with fear. But she pressed on. The walls of her bedroom became her audience. She whispered to them with urgency, as if the walls could carry her words beyond her silence, out into the world. Every poem became a rehearsal for life itself. Shakespeare, Dunbar, black spirituals, scripture. She whispered them all, tasting each word, feeling how it moved in her mouth, how it lingered in the air. And slowly, something changed. Her voice, once fragile, began to grow richer. She heard rhythm in her own speech. She discovered the melody hidden inside the words. It was as if her silence had not destroyed her voice, but polished it, preparing it for something greater. Still, she remained silent in public. At school, she never answered questions. When children teased her, she stared at the dirt, letting her silence be her shield. In church, she mouthed the hymns, but never sang them aloud. To the world, she was still mute. But the walls of her room knew better. They had heard the poems. They had heard the fire awakening. Sometimes, when she read, she imagined she was standing on a grand stage, her voice soaring across thousands of faces. She pictured crowds leaning forward to catch every word. Their hearts moved, their souls stirred. She was still a little girl in a small town, but in her imagination, she was already a poet, already a storyteller, already someone who could move the world with language. The contrast between who she was in silence and who she became in those whispered nights was stark. By day, she was invisible. By night, she was infinite. Her grandmother noticed faint traces of this transformation. One evening, she walked past Maya's door and paused. She could hear the faint murmur of a voice. Her heart jumped. Was the child finally speaking? She pressed her ear to the wood, but Maya stopped abruptly, clutching the book to her chest, afraid of being discovered. The grandmother didn't push. She simply whispered a prayer of gratitude. "The Lord is working on her," she murmured to herself. But to Maya, the journey still felt fragile. The guilt of the past lingered, whispering that her words were dangerous. She remembered the man who had died after she spoke, the way adults whispered about his death, the way her child's mind connected the two. That fear clung to her like a shadow. And yet, every time she whispered to the walls, the shadow receded just a little more. Every line of poetry, Every stanza of scripture became a small rebellion against the lie she had believed. Her words were not weapons of death. They were seeds of life. One night, she read Dunbar's line softly. "I know why the caged bird sings on me. When his wing is bruised and his bosom sore, when he beats his bars and he would be free. It is not a carol of joy or glee, but a prayer that he sends from his heart's deep core." She stopped, tears welling in her eyes. She was that bird, bruised, silent, caged. But she also carried a song inside her, a prayer rising from the core of her heart. The walls had heard her song. The silence was no longer her prison. It was becoming her training ground. Because somewhere deep within, Maya knew, a bird cannot stay caged forever. The world outside Maya's silence kept moving, unaware of the storm brewing inside her. Stamps, Arkansas, was a place of routine. Mornings filled with roosters crowing, afternoons thick with the heat of southern sun, and evenings where neighbors sat on porches gossiping in low voices. For everyone else, life was ordinary. For Maya, every day felt like walking through a dream, where she could see and hear everything but was unable to fully join. At school, the teacher's chalk scratched across the board, spelling lessons she already understood. Maya was bright, brighter than most, but her silence convinced her teachers otherwise. "She's not applying herself," one would mutter. Another shook her head, whispering, "The child is lost." They graded her poorly, not realizing she memorized every word, every lesson, every sound. Her silence hid her brilliance like a veil. Children laughed at her still, calling her names, mocking the way she sat in the back of the class, with eyes wide and mouth shut. But Maya endured it with a quiet dignity that made her seem older than her years. She didn't fight back, didn't cry, didn't give them her voice to twist. She let them speak, and in her silence, she observed. She noticed the arrogance in bullies, the insecurities behind their cruelty, the fragility of their laughter. She was learning human nature in ways they would never understand. Church was another stage for her silence. On Sundays, the air in the little black church swelled with song. Voices rose like thunder, feet stomped, hands clapped, and the preacher's voice rolled like waves against the congregation. Maya sat among them, lips pressed tight, heart swelling with every hymn. She memorized the cadences of prayer, the rhythm of sermons, the way a single line of scripture could move an entire room to tears. She didn't speak, but she was studying, collecting the sounds of power. Her grandmother remained her anchor, never forcing her, but always guiding her with faith. She gave Maya tasks to keep her hands busy, shelling peas, folding laundry, reciting scripture in her mind. The older woman saw something in her granddaughter that others couldn't. Where they saw silence, she saw waiting. Where they saw brokenness, she saw God's preparation. But not everyone understood. Some neighbors said cruel things. "That child ain't right." Others muttered superstitions about curses or punishment. Maya heard every word. Though they thought she was deaf to the world, her silence sharpened her hearing until she could catch whispers no one else noticed. Each remark cut her, but she never responded. The silence became her fortress, protecting her from the sting of cruelty. And yet, loneliness haunted her. There were nights she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wishing she could laugh with the other children, wishing she could share her thoughts, her fears, her dreams. Words swelled in her chest like a flood held back by a fragile dam. Sometimes she pressed her pillow to her face and whispered into it, just to hear her own voice in secret, to prove to herself she was still alive. Books remained her salvation. They carried her beyond the dusty roads of stamps, beyond the whispers of townsfolk, into worlds where children grew strong, where heroes overcame, where words changed everything. She read until her eyes ached, until the lantern flickered low, until the real world blurred into the one she imagined. And all the while, Mrs. Flower's voice echoed in her memory. Words are alive. They live inside us until we give them breath. So she kept practicing, whispering to herself when no one could hear. Some nights, she stood in front of the mirror, pretending she was a grand orator, her small body straight, her eyes fierce, her voice trembling but rising. She saw in herself not just a silent child, but a possibility. a shadow of the woman she might become. The world outside her silence kept calling, testing her patience, challenging her endurance. But Maya remained steadfast. She would not break. She would not give up. She was learning, growing, listening, preparing. Because though the world only saw a mute girl, Maya Angelou was becoming something greater. And when she finally chose to let her voice return, the world would never forget it. The house was quiet that evening, the kind of silence that wraps itself around you like a blanket, but leaves the soul restless. Outside, cicadas sang in their endless chorus, the Arkansas night heavy with humidity. Inside, a small lamp flickered on the wooden table, casting soft shadows on the walls. Maya sat cross-legged on the floor, her book open, but her eyes weren't moving across the page. Instead, she was staring at the words, willing them to leap into her body, to come alive the way Mrs. Flowers once described. Her lips parted. Nothing came out. Her throat tightened. She closed her mouth again. It was the same war every night. She wanted to speak, wanted to release the words that lived like prisoners inside her chest. But then the fear came, the voice in her head reminding her, if you speak, someone might die. Your words carry power, and power can destroy. She shut the book and hugged her knees, rocking gently, as if to comfort herself. The guilt of her stepfather's death had not loosened its grip on her. She was only a child, but she carried the weight of responsibility as though she were ancient. The silence was her punishment, her protection, her shield. Yet something inside her fought against it. The words wanted to live. That night, she crept into the small back room where an old, cracked mirror stood against the wall. The mirror was slightly warped, bending her reflection into something unfamiliar, almost magical. She stood in front of it, trembling. Slowly, she mouthed the words of a poem she had memorized. Her lips shaped the syllables, but her voice was barely a whisper. At first, she could hardly hear herself. Just a faint breath. She repeated the line, a little louder this time. Her voice cracked like an unused instrument being tuned for the first time in years. She flinched at the sound, her own sound. But then she leaned closer to the mirror, her reflection watching her, urging her. She whispered again, then again. Each time, the words grew clearer, steadier. The room felt different now, as if the air itself leaned in to listen. She wasn't ready to let anyone else hear. But here, alone, she could test her strength. The lines of poetry spilled softly into the stillness. Bravery hides in silence, but it waits for the day to rise. She had invented that line herself, clumsy, childlike, but born of truth. And as she spoke it, her reflection seemed to smile back at her. This became her ritual. Night after night, Maya stood before that mirror, whispering to herself, practicing. She tried poems, scripture, even little speeches she made up in her imagination. Some nights she wept between lines, the sound of her tears breaking the fragile whispers. Other nights, she felt powerful, like she was rehearsing for an audience that would one day fill a stadium. Her grandmother never interrupted, though she must have heard the faint murmurs through the walls. Perhaps she understood that this secret practice was not to be disturbed, that it was the seed of something greater. One evening, Maya slipped outside into the yard after everyone had gone to bed. The stars stretched endlessly above her, a river of light across the dark. She looked up, feeling the weight of the universe pressing down on her small shoulders. And then, with trembling lips, she whispered to the stars, I am still here. It was not loud, but it was real. And in that moment, she felt the words escape her chest like birds taking flight. She repeated it, a little stronger. I am still here. The words seemed to echo in the night, bouncing off trees, carried away by the wind. Maya stood there, barefoot on the dirt, whispering declarations into the sky, testing, exploring, learning the sound of her own existence. She knew no one else could hear her, and that was the beauty of it. This was her training ground, her rehearsal stage, her hidden classroom where fear could not silence her. The world still thought she was mute. At school, she never spoke. At church, she stayed silent. Around other children, her lips remained sealed. But in secret, Maya was building a foundation of sound, word by word, whisper by whisper. And though she didn't know it yet, These small, secret victories were preparing her for the day her voice would no longer belong only to her. One day, it would belong to the world. The late afternoon sun painted the Arkansas sky in streaks of orange and violet. The air smelled of dust and magnolia, heavy with the kind of summer heat that made even the trees seem too tired to move. Maya sat on the wooden steps of the porch, her knees tucked up, a book balanced in her lap. She wasn't reading this time. Her eyes traced the horizon, following the way the tall grass swayed in the wind. Inside the house, her grandmother hummed a gospel tune while preparing supper. The rhythm of it seeped through the thin wooden walls, grounding the silence that Maya carried everywhere with her. She ran her fingers across the spine of her book, hesitating, as if waiting for a signal that the moment was right. The wind picked up suddenly, sweeping across the yard, rustling through the trees, carrying with it the sounds of distant voices, neighbors laughing, a dog barking, a screen door slamming shut. Maya closed her eyes. Something stirred inside her, something she could no longer keep buried. She opened her mouth and let out a single word, just one, soft, nearly invisible. Hope. The breeze caught it, carried it away into the wide-open world. Her heart pounded. She had spoken outside, not in front of a mirror, not to the walls of her room, not whispered into her pillow at night, but here, under the sky, where the earth itself could hear her. For a moment she froze, waiting. Would the ground crack open? Would the heavens punish her again for daring to speak? But nothing happened. The wind simply lifted her word and danced with it, scattering it into the endless fields. She whispered another, her lips trembling. Courage. The word felt heavier, richer, as though it carried not just sound but memory, pain, and longing. Maya stood now, the book slipping from her lap and tumbling into the dust. She didn't notice. She raised her chin to the wind and let another word escape her lips. Alive. It startled her how strong it sounded, louder than she had intended, almost as though the wind itself had given her voice more power. The cicadas paused their chorus, then started again. A bird darted overhead. The world carried on, unbroken, undisturbed. And yet inside Maya, something was shifting. The chains of silence, forged from fear and guilt, loosened slightly, as if testing whether she was ready to be free. Her chest rose and fell with rapid breaths. For years she had carried the belief that her words could kill, that silence was the only way to protect those she loved. But now, standing barefoot in the dirt, her voice carried not death, but life. She whispered sentences, broken fragments of poems she remembered, half-lines from hymns her grandmother sang at church. At first they came awkwardly, like a child learning to walk. But soon they gained rhythm, carried by the pulse of her heart. The air itself seemed to listen. In that moment, she imagined that the wind was her audience, the trees leaning closer, the stars above waiting for their cue, the earth below steadying her trembling body. She wasn't speaking to people. She was speaking to the universe, practicing for a world she could not yet see but somehow knew was waiting for her. Her grandmother stepped onto the porch quietly, wiping her hands on her apron. She stopped when she saw Maya, standing in the yard, lips moving, her face tilted to the sky. The old woman didn't call out. She didn't interrupt. She only watched, her eyes softening with a deep understanding. Perhaps she had known all along that this moment would come, that the child's silence was never permanent, but simply the cocoon before the wings. Maya finished her whispered recital and lowered her head, embarrassed by her own daring. She turned, startled, when she saw her grandmother there. For a split second, fear gripped her chest. She thought the silence would return, thought she would be scolded, thought her fragile courage would shatter. But her grandmother only nodded, slow and steady, as if to say, "Yes, child. Keep going." Tears pricked Maya's eyes. She hadn't realized how badly she needed that silent blessing. That night, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her lips still tingling from the words she had let out. She repeated them quietly to herself, over and over. Hope, courage, alive. For the first time in years, she fell asleep not weighed down by guilt, but lifted by possibility. Her silence was breaking, not in a sudden burst, but in careful, tender fragments, like dawn creeping slowly over the horizon. And though she didn't yet know it, this was the beginning of a transformation that would carry her voice far beyond the fields of Arkansas, far beyond the walls of her childhood home. One day, these same lips would speak to the world, and the world would listen. The library in Stamps was not much to look at from the outside. A squat wooden building with peeling white paint and narrow windows, it stood at the corner of a dusty street, half hidden behind a row of stubborn oak trees. But to Maya, that building was not just a place. It was a world, a refuge, a temple where silence was not punishment but power. She walked there with deliberate steps, clutching her library card in her pocket like it was a sacred key. Her shoes kicked up small clouds of dust with every stride. Other children passed her on the way, laughing, their voices trailing behind like ribbons. Maya didn't mind. She carried her silence as others carried laughter. And she knew, once inside those doors, the books would be waiting. The wooden floor creaked when she entered. The smell hit her first, a mix of old paper, polished wood, and ink, the scent of history itself. The air was cooler inside, dim but alive, as though every shelf breathed softly with the weight of countless voices. Maya walked between the rows of books, her fingers brushing the spines with reverence. Here, she was not the quiet girl. Here, she was not the child who refused to speak. She was a traveler, a seeker, an adventurer crossing oceans, stepping into castles, sitting beside poets and philosophers. She found her corner, a wooden chair by the window where sunlight pooled like golden ink. Settling into it, she opened her chosen book, and the world outside dissolved. On those pages, she found a chorus of voices. Shakespeare whispered to her about destiny and sorrow. Dickens painted worlds of injustice and endurance. Black writers whose names the town rarely spoke thundered with truths that burned hotter than the Arkansas sun. They did not laugh at her silence. They did not demand explanations. They only asked that she listen. And listen she did, with every fiber of her being. Sometimes, she would copy down words in a notebook, tracing them again and again as if writing them could make them hers. The act felt sacred. Each word she copied was a seed planted deep in her mind. She watered them with imagination, and slowly they began to grow into sentences of her own, whispered in secret when no one could hear. One afternoon, the librarian, a tall, thin woman with silver-rimmed glasses and a voice as sharp as chalk on slate, approached her. She looked down at Maya, at the mountain of books stacked on the little wooden table. "You're here almost every day," the librarian said. It wasn't a question, but an observation. Maya glanced up, heart pounding. She didn't speak. She simply nodded. The librarian tilted her head, curious, but not unkind. "Well, keep reading. You'll find your own voice in there somewhere." The word struck her like a prophecy. Your own voice. That night, lying in bed, she repeated those words in her head until they wrapped around her like a blanket. Her voice was in there, somewhere, trapped between the pages, waiting for her to claim it. Days turned into weeks, and her trips to the library became ritual. She read so much that the stories began to seep into her dreams. She would wake in the middle of the night with lines of poetry rolling in her head, unable to stop them. She scribbled them onto scraps of paper, hiding them beneath her mattress like stolen treasures. The library taught her something crucial. Silence did not mean emptiness. Within her, worlds collided and expanded. She was silent on the outside, but her mind was a roaring river. And slowly, she began to sense that one day, the river would break through. One afternoon, she stumbled upon a collection of poems. They were short, sharp, and luminous. She traced her finger across each line, mouthing the words silently, feeling their rhythm in her chest. They were alive in a way that prose was not. Each poem like a heartbeat, each line like breath itself. Maya realized then that poetry was not just writing. It was voice turned into art. And perhaps, just perhaps, it could become her bridge back to speech. That evening, as the crickets began their chorus outside and the stars blinked into the sky, Maya stood at her window and whispered a poem. It was only 4 lines, a nursery rhyme she had memorized. But when the words slipped past her lips, something in her chest unclenched. The silence was cracking, little by little, not with force, but with beauty. And it all began in that small library, with shelves heavy with voices that had waited centuries for her to find them. The sun was sinking low over stamps, the sky painted in hues of copper and violet, when Maya felt the first real tremor of change. She had just returned from the library, arms aching from the books pressed to her chest. Her grandmother, Mama Henderson, was sweeping the porch with deliberate strokes, her back straight, as though even the act of sweeping carried the dignity of prayer. Maya lingered near the steps, hugging the books tighter. She wanted to say something, anything, to acknowledge her grandmother's steady strength, her unwavering presence. But as always, the words trembled at the edge of her tongue, afraid to leap into the air. She climbed the steps quietly and sat on the porch, pretending to read. The twilight deepened. A dog barked in the distance. The silence between her and her grandmother stretched wide, heavy but not unkind. Then Mama spoke. "You keep them books close, don't you, sister?" Her voice was calm, not pressing, but it carried the weight of knowing. Maya nodded, lowering her gaze. "You gon' learn something mighty important in them pages," Mama continued, leaning on the broom handle. "A person who knows words, child, can never be truly trapped. Words can set you free." The statement echoed in Maya's mind like a church bell. Words can set you free. That night, lying in her narrow bed, she repeated the phrase over and over, until it sank deep into her bones. And then, in the shadows, she dared to whisper a single word, her first word in months. It was small, shaky, almost soundless. Freedom. The moment it left her lips, she felt a shock ripple through her body, as if she had broken some invisible chain. Her heart raced. She sat up, her breath quick and sharp. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't even a full sentence. But it was something. The next day, she carried that secret word inside her like a hidden ember. At the library, when she opened a book of poetry, she whispered it again under her breath, shaping it carefully with her lips. Freedom. Each time she repeated it, the ember glowed brighter. She began adding new words, practicing silently when no one was near. Hope, courage, tomorrow. The words felt fragile, like delicate glass ornaments, but each one added to her strength. One afternoon, she was sitting in her usual library corner when a boy from town passed by. He glanced at her pile of books and snorted. "What you doin' with all that readin'? Ain't nobody care what's in them pages." The words stung, sharp as a slap, but instead of shrinking, Maya felt something rise inside her. She wanted to answer him, to throw back words as sharp as his, to defend the sanctuary she had found. Her lips parted. A sound came, rough and broken, but real. The boy's smirk faltered, and he walked away. Maya's heart thundered in her chest. She had spoken, not loudly, not clearly, but enough to remind herself that she could. That night, she sat by the window, watching the stars. She whispered a full sentence for the first time. "My voice will come back." The words felt strange, shaky, but they were hers. She repeated them again and again until her whisper grew into a steady murmur. With each repetition, her silence cracked further, and the river of language, long dammed, began to stir. She didn't tell anyone. To the outside world, she was still the silent girl. But inside, the storm was gathering. Every book she read, every poem she memorized, every whispered word in the dark was fuel. And though the world around her could not hear it yet, Maya Angelou's voice, once buried under the rubble of fear and guilt, was beginning to rise. The church in Stamps was alive with sound that Sunday. The wooden pews creaked as families settled in, the air thick with the smell of starch-press clothes and the faint perfume of homemade soaps. Voices rose in him, weaving together into a tapestry of praise. The organ swelled, the choir clapped, and for a moment the humble wooden walls seemed to breathe with the power of belief. Maya sat near the back, a thin girl with observant eyes, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She did not sing, as she never did. Her lips moved occasionally, mimicking words she had memorized, but no sound escaped. She listened instead, soaking in every note, every cadence, every tremor of passion that came from the voices around her. And then the Reverend began to preach. His words rolled across the congregation like thunder, fierce and insistent, his voice rising and falling in waves. "The Lord gave us a voice, my brothers and sisters," he cried. "A voice to speak truth, to cry out against injustice, to lift our people higher." The congregation roared back with amens and hallelujahs, but Maya felt those words burrow deep into her. "The Lord gave us a voice." Her fingers clenched together. She thought of the words she had whispered in secret, freedom, and of the sentence she had dared to speak to herself, "My voice will come back." It felt as though the Reverend's words had been aimed directly at her, a command from the heavens. As the choir rose again, something shifted inside Maya. She closed her eyes, and though her lips stayed sealed, she sang in her mind, every note, every rise and fall, as if the music itself had planted roots in her. Her chest swelled. Her throat ached with the longing to release it. That afternoon, when the church had emptied and the dust hung golden in the sunlight, Maya lingered in the pews. The hush after so much sound felt sacred. Slowly, nervously, she opened her mouth. At first, nothing came. Then a whisper, cracked and faint, a single line from the hymn. "Every time I feel the Spirit." Her voice broke, but she pressed on. The next word came a little stronger, and then another. "Moving in my heart. I will pray." Her own voice startled her. It was weak, trembling, yet undeniable. She clutched the edge of the pew, tears pricking her eyes. For the first time in years, she was not simply whispering borrowed words in the dark, she was singing. Over the next weeks, she nurtured that fragile sound. In the quiet of her room, she whispered poems, then murmured sentences, then let her voice climb into verses of hymns she had memorized since childhood. At first she was cautious, checking over her shoulder as though someone might snatch the sound away. But soon the fear lessened. The words began to flow smoother, richer, carrying not just meaning but her very essence. One evening, Bailey caught her humming as she folded clothes. He froze, eyes wide. "Maya," he whispered, as though he were afraid to scare it off. She blushed, lowering her gaze, her hands fumbling with the fabric. "You spoke," he said softly, awe in his voice. You sang." Her throat tightened, shame and pride warring inside her. She wanted to deny it, to retreat back into silence. But Bailey's face, lit with wonder, with relief, stirred something fierce in her. "Yes," she said quietly. The word came clear, unbroken. Bailey grinned, tears brimming. "I knew you'd come back." From that night, Maya's silence was no longer unbroken. She did not shout, she did not chatter, but she spoke here and there, small sentences at first, then longer ones. Each time felt like crossing a threshold, like reclaiming a piece of herself that had been locked away. Still, she held back in public. In school, she rarely answered questions. In church, she hummed more than she sang. But inside her, the dam had cracked, and the river would not be stopped forever. She had tasted her own voice again, and like a song long silenced, it was slowly, inevitably rising toward the world. The days after Maya's voice returned in whispers felt like stepping onto fragile ice. Every word she spoke seemed risky, as though the silence might reclaim her if she pressed too hard. But each morning, she woke with a strange new resolve humming inside her chest. At school, the teacher called her name during roll. Normally, Maya raised her hand in silence. That day, she whispered, "Here." It was so soft that only the girl beside her turned in surprise. But the teacher's eyes flickered, registering the sound. For Maya, that moment was monumental. She had spoken where others could hear. Yet, the weight of speech pressed heavily on her shoulders. The silence had been her shield, her sanctuary. Now, every word felt like an exposure, a confession. She carried the fear that someone might laugh, that the sound of her voice would be too fragile, too broken, too strange. One afternoon, Mrs. Bertha Flowers invited her again, this time for tea and cookies. The parlor was warm, filled with books stacked like old friends against the walls. Maya sat with her back straight, hands folded, waiting for Mrs. Flowers to speak. But instead of reading, the older woman looked directly at her and said, "Marguerite, I'd like you to read aloud for me today." The words hit Maya like a storm. Her stomach clenched. She hadn't read aloud in years. Her throat felt dry, her palms damp. Mrs. Flowers handed her a slim book of poetry. "Start with this," she said gently. Maya's hands trembled as she opened to the marked page. The words swam for a moment, as if testing her courage. She drew a shaky breath and began. "Phenomenal woman." Her voice cracked. She shut her eyes, trying again. "Phenomenal woman, that's me." The sound startled her. It was uneven, hesitant, but it carried rhythm, cadence. The room held its breath as she read, each word pulling her further into the poem's embrace. Mrs. Flowers nodded softly, her eyes shining with approval. "You see, child, words are meant to be spoken. They live when they are given sound. And your voice carries them like wings." Tears pricked Maya's eyes. She hadn't realized until that moment how much she missed hearing herself give life to words. Her silence had been heavy, suffocating. But here, in this quiet parlor, her voice had returned like a forgotten melody. Still, outside the sanctuary, the challenge grew. At school, the children noticed she was speaking more, and some teased her. They mimicked her soft tones, giggled at her pauses. Each laugh was a knife. She felt the pull of silence, trying to drag her back. That night, Bailey found her sitting alone, staring at her hands. "They laughed," she whispered. "Let them laugh," Bailey said firmly. "They don't know what it cost you to speak. They don't know how strong you are." His words anchored her. She looked at him, saw the fire in his eyes, and realized she wasn't fighting alone. The next day, when the teacher called on her to read, she hesitated, then lifted her chin. Slowly, deliberately, she spoke. Her voice wavered, but it carried through the room. The giggles came, sharp and cruel, but she kept reading. Each word was a battle, each sentence a victory. When she finished, the classroom was quiet. The laughter had died away. Her teacher gave a small nod, pride flickering in her gaze. Walking home, Maya felt exhausted but lighter. For the first time, she understood that her voice was not just returning. It was growing stronger because she dared to use it, even against the weight of doubt. Her silence had once defined her childhood, but now, every word she spoke was redefining her future. The winter air and stamps hung heavy with stillness, like the silence that had shadowed Maya for years. She was older now, taller, her eyes wiser than her age. Yet that silence still lingered inside her like an old scar. It no longer imprisoned her completely, but it whispered, always waiting for the right moment to return. One Sunday morning, the church brimmed with voices. The choir sang loud and proud, their voices reaching the rafters in waves of praise. Maya sat on the wooden pew, hands folded, staring at the hymn book. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Singing in front of others felt impossible. Then came Reverend Taylor's booming voice. "Let every child in here lift up their voice to God. Don't be afraid of your sound. He gave it to you." Maya's heart pounded. Bailey nudged her gently, whispering, "Come on, sis. Sing." Her throat tightened. The hymn began again. At first, she mouthed the words silently, but then a whisper slipped out. A single note, weak, trembling, nearly drowned by the congregation. But it was hers. She pushed again, another note, stronger this time. Soon, she was singing, not loudly, not boldly, but enough that her own ears heard it. Her grandmother, sitting nearby, caught it. She turned, her wrinkled face breaking into a proud smile. "That's it, baby," she murmured, though Maya barely heard it over the music. For the first time, her voice had risen inside a crowd. It felt like tearing down a wall brick by brick. That afternoon, walking home, Bailey teased her. "Didn't know you had a song in you." She laughed nervously, shaking her head. It was nothing. But deep inside, she knew it wasn't nothing. It was everything. Later that week, Mrs. Flowers invited Maya once more. This time, she didn't hand her a book. Instead, she asked, "Do you know why I ask you to read out loud?" Maya shook her head. "Because silence is heavy, Marguerite. It can crush a soul. But words, when spoken, free you. They heal. They remind you who you are." Maya lowered her gaze. She wanted to believe that, but she still carried the memory of that dark night, the man who had stolen her innocence. A part of her still believed her voice had caused his death. Mrs. Flowers, sensing her struggle, leaned closer. What happened to you was not your fault. Your silence is not a punishment you owe. It is a chain you've wrapped around yourself. And chains are meant to be broken. The words hit her like thunder. Tears welled up in Maya's eyes, spilling down her cheeks. No one had spoken so directly, so truthfully, about the wound she carried. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, staring at the moonlight painting silver shadows on the floor. Bailey, half asleep, muttered, "Why you up?" "I was thinking," she whispered. Maybe my voice isn't dangerous. Maybe it's the only thing that can save me." Bailey turned over, his voice groggy but firm. "It is the only thing. You're stronger than you think." The following week at school, her teacher asked for volunteers to recite. For a moment, the silence around Maya grew thick again. Her chest tightened, her palms sweated. But then, before she could stop herself, her hand rose. The class went quiet in surprise. The teacher's eyebrows lifted. "Marguerite," Maya stood, her knees trembling. She clutched the book, took a deep breath, and began to read. Her voice wavered at first, but the rhythm of the words steadied her. By the second stanza, her tone grew stronger, her back straighter. The children who once laughed sat still, listening. Some even leaned in. When she finished, the room erupted in a scattered clap. Her teacher's smile was radiant. Maya sat down, her heart racing. For the first time, she hadn't just spoken, she had commanded a room. Walking home, she whispered to herself, "The silence isn't me. The silence is gone." It wasn't completely gone, not yet, but each word spoken was another link shattered. She was no longer the girl defined by silence. She was the girl breaking free, one voice at a time. The sun rose over Stamps with a soft golden glow, spilling across the red clay roads and wooden porches. It was the kind of morning that made everything feel possible, even for a little black girl who had carried silence as her shadow for far too long. Maya stood on the porch, barefoot, the dew still cool under her feet, watching the world awaken. For years, mornings had been filled with dread, another day to remain unseen, unheard. But this morning felt different. Bailey came out behind her, yawning and rubbing his eyes. "What you doing out here so early?" "Listening," Maya said simply. She tilted her head as the birds sang in the distance. They sing without fear. Nobody tells them their voices don't belong. Bailey smirked. "Maybe you're finally ready to do the same." That day, Mrs. Flowers had prepared something special. She greeted Maya with her usual grace, the scent of freshly baked cookies floating through her parlor. But instead of a book, she held out a single slip of paper. On it were a few lines from Shakespeare. "Read these for me, child," she said softly. Maya hesitated, her fingers trembling as she held the paper. The silence inside her tried to rise again, heavy and suffocating. But then she looked into Mrs. Flowers' eyes, warm, steady, unshakable. There was no judgment there, only belief. Belief that her voice mattered. Maya inhaled deeply, her chest rising with courage. And then, slowly but surely, she began. "The quality of mercy is not strained." The words fell like music into the room. Her voice, once a timid whisper, now carried strength, rhythm, and truth. With each syllable, the chains of silence broke apart. By the time she finished, Mrs. Flowers was smiling so wide it seemed as though the whole world could see her pride. "Do you hear yourself?" Mrs. Flowers asked gently. Maya blinked back tears. "Yes." "Good," Mrs. Flowers said. "Now never forget that sound. That's the voice of a girl who will not be broken." That night, as she lay in bed, Maya thought back to the moment when silence had first swallowed her, after the violence, after the tragedy, after believing her voice had the power to kill. For years, she thought quietness kept her safe. But now she understood. Silence had been her prison, not her protection. Her words weren't a curse. They were her freedom. Days turned into weeks, and Maya practiced speaking more. In school, she read aloud. At church, she sang just a little louder. At home, she told Bailey stories before bed, weaving magic into her words until even he was captivated. Her voice was still finding its strength, but it was alive, and so was she. One evening, As the sun dipped low and painted the sky in fiery oranges, Bailey looked at her with that mischievous grin of his. You know, one day, people gonna pay money just to hear you talk. Maya laughed, shaking her head. Don't be silly. But in that laugh was a spark of possibility, a whisper of the future, a glimpse of the woman she would become, poet, activist, truth-teller, a woman whose voice would shake the world. The silence that had once defined her was now gone. In its place stood a girl with words powerful enough to heal wounds, inspire hope, and carve a path forward, not only for herself, but for countless others. As she closed her eyes that night, Maya thought, if my words can bring life back to me, maybe one day they can bring life to the world. And with that thought, her journey truly began. When Maya finally found the courage to speak again, it wasn't just a voice returning, it was resilience. Backhand index pointing right. Resilience means the ability to recover quickly after difficulties, to bounce back from pain. She spoke words with conviction, her voice no longer trembling. Backhand index pointing right. Conviction means strong belief or confidence in what you say or do. Her silence had once been her prison, but words became her liberation. Backhand index pointing right. Prison is a place of being trapped, and liberation means freedom, release, or victory over something holding you back. This moment teaches us a powerful English expression. Backhand index pointing right, finding your voice. It doesn't just mean speaking literally. It means discovering your true self, your strength, and your purpose. Maya's story shows us another important phrase. Backhand index pointing right, words carry power. This reminds us that language shapes reality. It can hurt, heal, or inspire. Silence is not weakness. Even when life forces you into quietness, it can be a time of growth. Use your silence to listen, to learn, and to prepare for the moment you rise. Your voice matters. No matter who tries to suppress you, your words and truth have meaning. Speak them with courage, even if your voice shakes. Pain can be transformed into purpose. The deepest wounds can become the source of your greatest strength, if you choose to rise instead of break. Find mentors who believe in you. Just like Mrs. Flowers believed in Maya, you need people around you who see your potential even when you can't. Language is freedom. Learning to express yourself, whether through writing, speaking, or art, is one of the most powerful tools for liberation and change. So remember this. Maya Angelou's journey from silence to unstoppable greatness is proof that your voice is your power. Don't bury it. Don't doubt it. Let it rise, because one sentence, one poem, one truth from you could be the spark that changes someone's life. Stand tall, speak boldly, and carry this with you. Backhand index pointing right. The world does not just need noise. It needs your voice.